No one wanted to care for the crippled Mafia boss until a desperate mother and her 2 little daughters knocked on his door. Cormac Sullivan was 37 years old when his life split in two. Before the assassination attempt, he was a man who'd never known defeat, the undisputed king of Chicago's underworld, controlling gambling rings, loan sharks, protection rackets, and smuggling routes through the city's ports, accustomed to ending lives with a single nod, always dressed in perfectly tailored 3-piece suits with steel gray eyes that made grown men kneel without him ever raising his voice. He lived in a fortress of a mansion in Lake Forest, 12 bedrooms behind 10-foot walls, surveillance cameras watching every shadow, and 20 guards rotating around the clock. Power, fear, respect, an empire built on blood and silence, a schedule filled with meetings where others begged for mercy or favor. No one imagined that in a single night, all of it would shatter. It was a Friday. A secret meeting in an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's industrial South Side. Cormac sat at the head of the table discussing expansion into Milwaukee territory with his most trusted men when the lights cut out. 3 gunshots cracked through the darkness. 1 bullet tore through his shoulder. 1 ripped into his abdomen. The 3rd shattered something in his lower spine. He collapsed into a pool of his own blood while his brother-in-law Patrick screamed orders and fired blindly into the shadows. The shooter vanished through the emergency exit before anyone could see his face. When Cormac woke in the family's private medical facility under Dr. Henry Whitmore's care, he didn't understand why he couldn't feel his legs. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. He saw the tight faces of the doctors and knew something was terribly wrong. The following weeks were a blur of surgeries, agony, and news that fell like stones. Spinal cord damage, irreversible. The probability of ever walking again was almost 0. Cormac didn't cry when they told him. He just stared at the white ceiling as if waiting for someone to say it was all a mistake. But no one said that. If you're hooked and want to see how a broken monster finds redemption in the most unexpected place, smash that like button, share this story with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the moment Cormac Sullivan returned to his mansion, not as a king, but as a wounded beast trapped in a golden cage. 6 months after the assassination attempt, Cormac Sullivan returned to the estate in Lake Forest. But he wasn't the man he'd been before. They had to install a private elevator because he couldn't move up the stairs on his own anymore. The wheelchair became an extension of his body, a constant reminder of what he'd lost. Cormac's personality changed completely. The man who'd once been cold and in control of everything turned bitter, volatile, exploding without warning. In 6 months, he fired 14 nurses and caregivers. The first was dismissed for looking at him with pity. The second was dismissed for moving a chair in the room without permission. The third was dismissed for crying when he screamed in her face. And it kept going like that. Some couldn't last more than a week. Some walked out after the very first shift. The reputation of the crippled boss with an unbearable temper spread across Chicago. Cormac lived in darkness. He ordered the curtains drawn over every window, refused to see anyone except those truly necessary. The second-floor bedroom became his den, where he sat for hours in silence, with only a bottle of whiskey and the dark as his companions. Meanwhile, the people around him began to move like chess pieces on a board he no longer controlled. Patrick Brennan, Cormac's brother-in-law, quietly took over the important meetings under the excuse that his brother-in-law needed rest to recover. He showed up in rooms where only Cormac had once sat at the head of the table, making decisions in place of the man rotting in the dark upstairs. Meredith Kensington, the Sullivan family's attorney for 10 years and also Deirdre's closest friend, took control of the finances. She reviewed the books, approved the transactions, and no one knew that every dollar was quietly flowing into secret accounts Cormac didn't even know existed. Dr. Henry Whitmore, who'd cared for the Sullivan family for 20 years, came for weekly checkups. He prescribed high-dose painkillers that left Cormac dulled, always hovering between waking and sleep. Every time someone mentioned physical therapy, Whitmore shook his head and said the damage was too severe, that trying would only bring him more pain. And Cormac believed him. The only person who could enter Cormac's room without being thrown out was Finn O'Malley, the head of security who'd followed him for 15 years. The 60-year-old, with silver hair and eyes sharp as a blade, often carried food upstairs and stood in silence until Cormac finished eating. Sometimes he told him news about the Empire, but Cormac rarely responded. Finn saw the change in the man he'd sworn to protect, and it made his heart ache. Deirdre Sullivan, Cormac's sister, searched desperately for a solution. She called every home health agency in the city, but the moment they heard the name Cormac Sullivan and the Lake Forest address, they refused outright. No one wanted to care for a disabled mafia boss known for firing people like changing shirts. Money wasn't the problem anymore. Fear was the barrier. Deirdre didn't know what else to do. She watched her brother rot a little more each day in that dark room and felt completely powerless. She didn't know that, even now, a woman on the other side of the city was standing before a choice that would change everything. At that same time, on Chicago's South Side, Phoebe Langston woke at 4 o'clock in the morning in a cramped studio apartment that was barely more than 200 square feet. She lay between her two daughters on an old, full bed, the only bed in the apartment. Emmeline, 6 years old, curled in on herself in sleep, her face pinched as if she were caught in a nightmare. Rosalie, 4, clutched a worn stuffed bear named Mr. Buttons, the last gift her father had given her before everything collapsed. Phoebe looked at her girls and felt a sharp ache bloom in her chest. She reached for her phone to check her bank account, even though she already knew the answer. $43. That was all she had left until the end of the month. But today was the day she had to pay the hospice facility for her mother. $4,500 a month to keep Dorothy Langston, 58 years old, properly cared for, in the final days of end-stage lung cancer. Phoebe didn't have that money. She didn't know where she was supposed to find it. 3 years earlier, Phoebe's life had been completely different. She had Jonathan, a gentle husband who worked hard to provide for their little family. They weren't rich, but they got by. They had love. They had hope for the future. Then one night in November, Jonathan was working the night shift at the convenience store near their home when 2 armed robbers rushed in. Jonathan tried to protect the 19-year-old clerk working with him and was shot twice in the chest. He lay in the ICU for 2 weeks, his body kept alive by machines, while Phoebe sat beside him and prayed for a miracle that never came. When Jonathan died, he left behind $170,000 in medical bills, and the insurance covered only a small fraction. Phoebe was 27, but she looked past 30. Brown hair pulled into a neat high tie, clothes clean but old and patched in too many places. The eyes that used to shine now carried deep dark circles from endless lack of sleep. She was so thin her shoulder bones stood out beneath her light shirt. Not because she was dieting, but because she kept giving her portion to her children. Every day she worked 3 jobs. In the morning, she cleaned 2 houses in Wicker Park. At midday, she waited tables at a small diner on Taylor Street. At night, she cared for an elderly man with Alzheimer's until his family came home. And still, it wasn't enough. Money kept slipping away like water through her fingers. Rent, utilities, food for the girls, school costs, medication, and the mountain of medical debt pressed down like a stone tied to her neck, never shrinking no matter how long she paid. Phoebe slid out of bed carefully so she wouldn't wake the girls. She stepped into the tiny bathroom, locked the door, and turned on the faucet so the running water could drown out the sound of her sobs. She cried in silence like she did every night, both hands clamped over her mouth so not a sound escaped. She never cried in front of Emmeline and Rosalie. She never let them see their mother break. But inside the tight 4 walls of that bathroom in the middle of the night, Phoebe let herself fall apart for a few minutes before she wiped her tears and kept living. That morning, just after Phoebe had wiped away her tears and was about to wake the girls for school, her phone rang. It was a call from a home health agency she'd applied to months ago and had almost forgotten. The woman on the line spoke plainly, with no small talk. There was a caregiving job paying $12,000 a month, with room and board included for her, and for her 2 daughters too if she wanted to bring them. Phoebe thought she'd misheard. $12,000. 4 times what she was making now from 3 jobs combined. She asked again, and the woman confirmed the number. But then her voice lowered. The agency warned her the patient was extremely difficult, had fired 14 people in 6 months, and no one had lasted more than 2 weeks. They said this was a dangerous man, and she would have to sign an absolute confidentiality agreement. They wouldn't reveal the patient's identity over the phone. Phoebe went quiet for a long time. She thought about the stories she'd heard, about wealthy bosses and criminals. She thought about what could happen to her, to her children, if she walked into something dark. But then her eyes dropped to the stack of overdue bills on the table, to the empty refrigerator, to the message from the hospice facility reminding her the payment deadline was close. She didn't have another choice. She agreed to the interview. Phoebe left Emmeline and Rosalie with her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a kind Vietnamese woman who'd helped her more times than Phoebe could count in her worst moments. Then she took 2 buses and 1 L train from the south side to Lake Forest, a trip that lasted nearly 2 hours across the city. When she got off and walked toward the address they'd given her, she almost turned around and ran. In front of her stood a massive estate hidden behind a tall iron gate, security cameras everywhere. A stone wall wrapped the property, higher than her head, refusing to let anyone see inside. This wasn't a normal home. This was a fortress. Phoebe stood at the gate, her heart pounding. Every instinct in her screamed to leave, to get away, to believe this place was dangerous, to believe no amount of money was worth the risk. But then she thought of Emmeline needing tuition money, of Rosalie needing a dental visit, of her mother lying in the hospice facility waiting for care Phoebe couldn't afford. She drew a deep breath and pressed the buzzer. Deirdre Sullivan greeted her in a lavish living room with high ceilings and a crystal chandelier. She was a red-haired woman with tired green eyes, no makeup, and a worn look that didn't match the wealth surrounding her. Deirdre explained the situation without dressing it up. Her brother had been badly injured and now used a wheelchair. He would scream in Phoebe's face, insult her, and he might throw things at her. If Phoebe still wanted to try, she could start today. Phoebe held Deirdre's gaze and gave her the only condition she had. Her 2 daughters had to live with her. She wasn't leaving them behind. Deirdre hesitated, then nodded because there was no one else willing to take the job. That afternoon, Deirdre led Phoebe up to the 2nd floor and stopped in front of a closed oak door at the end of the hallway. She looked at Phoebe with an expression that held both hope and pity, then walked away without another word. Phoebe stood alone before the door, drew a steadying breath, knocked softly, and stepped inside. The room was pitch dark, the stale air carrying the ghost of whiskey and old cigarette smoke. The curtains were pulled tight, not allowing a single blade of light to slip through. It took Phoebe a few seconds for her eyes to adjust before she saw the shape of a man in a wheelchair, his back turned to the window as if he were trying to keep the outside world as far away as possible. She greeted him and introduced herself as the new caregiver. A voice came from the darkness, cold and rough from disuse, like a man who hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. "Get out, like the 14 before you. Get out." Phoebe didn't leave. Calmly, she said she'd set dinner on the table by the door, and if he didn't eat, she'd bring breakfast up in the morning. Then she closed the door gently and walked out without waiting for a response. That first night, Phoebe lay in the small room set aside for staff on the 1st floor and listened to breaking sounds from upstairs, glass striking the wall, a ceramic plate exploding against the floor. Maybe Cormac had thrown the tray she'd left into the wall. She didn't go up to check. The next morning, she cleaned up the shards in silence and carried up a fresh breakfast. The next 2 weeks were hell. Cormac did everything he could to drive Phoebe away. He screamed in her face every time she entered the room. He threw whatever was within reach, from a water glass to books to an expensive desk clock. He insulted her with the most poisonous words he could think of. He called her a starving stray cat clinging to his money. He said she had to be desperate to stay with a cripple like him. He mocked her worn clothes, her scuffed heels, her thin, pale look. But Phoebe didn't cry. She didn't leave. She didn't beg him to be polite, didn't plead for a chance, didn't look at him with pity or fear. She only cleaned up whatever he shattered, carried up new food to replace the meals he refused, and kept doing her work with a patience that felt almost frightening. Cormac began to grow curious. Why didn't she cry like the others? Why didn't she run? He ordered Finn to investigate her background, and when the report landed in his hands, he learned about the husband who died in a robbery, the crushing mountain of medical debt, the mother dying of cancer in a hospice facility Phoebe couldn't afford. He used those facts like weapons, driving them straight into her wounds. One night, when Phoebe brought up dinner, Cormac turned his wheelchair to face her for the first time, caught in the dim reach of a desk lamp. He stared into her eyes and asked in a voice as cold as ice, "Your husband lay in the hospital for 2 weeks before he died, with that $170,000 bill. Did you ever wish he'd died sooner so it wouldn't cost as much?" Phoebe stood still. Her hands tightened around the tray until her knuckles went white. She could feel anger rise and boil in her chest, but her voice stayed steady when she answered. "I wish every day he was still alive, no matter how much it would have cost. But I don't think you understand that, because you don't even have anyone to lose." She set the tray down on the table and walked out before Cormac could react. The door closed softly behind her. That night, for the first time in 6 months, Cormac didn't throw anything. He just sat in the darkness, staring into the space in front of him, and thought about what she'd said. You don't even have anyone to lose. The words hit him harder than any bullet, because they were true. He had an empire, he had money, he had power, but he didn't have anyone who truly belonged to him. After the initial 3 weeks of trial, Emmeline and Rosalie had fully settled into their new life at the estate. Phoebe settled the girls into a small room right next to hers on the first floor, as far from Cormac's territory on the second floor as she could manage. She warned them again and again not to go upstairs, not to make noise, not to run through the house. Emmeline, 6 years old, understood and nodded with a serious little face. But Rosalie, 4, didn't understand what rules were for. One afternoon, while Phoebe was doing laundry in the basement, Rosalie sat bored and alone in the room with her stuffed bear, Mr. Buttons. She was curious about this enormous house and decided to explore. She climbed the grand staircase, walked down a long hallway lined with paintings, and stopped in front of the oak door at the very end. The door was cracked open just a sliver. Rosalie pushed it wider and stepped inside. Cormac sat in his wheelchair by the window. For the first time in months, he'd pulled the curtains back to look out at the garden. Late afternoon sunlight poured into the room that had always been drowned in darkness. When he heard the sound, he turned and froze when he saw that it wasn't Phoebe or Finn, but a little girl with blonde curls and wide eyes looking at him without an ounce of fear. Rosalie tilted her head, studied him for a moment, then asked in a clear, innocent voice, "Who are you? Why are you sitting on a chair with wheels? Can you push me around and take me to play?" Cormac didn't know how to react. For 6 months he'd grown used to driving adults away with insults and rage, but he'd never faced a 4-year-old who looked straight into his eyes and didn't flinch. He opened his mouth to yell for someone to come take her away, but Rosalie had already run up beside him and touched the wheel with delighted fascination. "Your chair is so pretty. The wheels are shiny." Right then, Phoebe rushed in, pale with panic. She apologized over and over and pulled Rosalie back, eyes dropped to the floor, not daring to meet Cormac's gaze. She was sure this would be the moment he fired her for not controlling her child. But Cormac only watched them leave without saying a word. The door closed. That night, he didn't shout for a new caregiver. In the weeks that followed, Emmeline and Rosalie slowly slipped into Cormac's lonely world without meaning to. Rosalie kept sneaking upstairs to talk to the man in the wheelchair. She told him about preschool, about Miss Patterson, about Mr. Buttons, the bear her dad had given her before he went up to heaven. She asked if he wanted to hear her sing, and then she sang anyway without waiting for an answer. Cormac didn't respond, but he didn't send her away either. Emmeline was different. At 6, she was quiet, watching more than she spoke. She looked at Cormac with an unjudging gaze, just like her mother. One day, she left a scribbled drawing outside his door. It showed a person sitting on a chair with wheels, a big sun overhead, and in crayon letters, shaky and uneven, it said, "Get well soon." Phoebe began to notice small changes in Cormac. He started finishing the meals she cooked instead of throwing them away like before. He allowed her to open the curtains in the morning and let sunlight spill into his room. He stopped throwing things, and the sudden rages grew rarer, then faded. The room didn't reek of whiskey the way it used to. One night, when Phoebe brought dinner up later than usual, she found Cormac sitting by the desk lamp with Emmeline's drawing in his hands. He studied it under the warm yellow light, his finger tracing the messy lines made by a 6-year-old's crayon. When he heard the door open, he quickly hid the drawing as if he'd been caught doing something shameful. But Phoebe had seen it. She didn't say anything. She set the tray on the table and walked out. But that night, for the first time since she'd come to this house, she smiled. The following week, Dr. Henry Whitmore came for the usual checkup. He carried his black leather bag and wore a gravity that looked carefully practiced. After a quick, almost careless examination, he sat down beside Cormac's bed and slowly shook his head. He said there was no progress, that the spinal cord damage was too severe, that Cormac should accept the reality that the wheelchair would be his companion for the rest of his life. Trying would only bring him more pain. He increased the dose of pain medication and told Cormac to rest more before he left. Phoebe stood outside the door and heard every word. She watched the doctor walk past her with a polite smile that felt false, and something in her tightened because it didn't feel right. She didn't have a medical degree. She didn't understand spinal cord injuries. But she understood surrender. And what Whitmore had just said sounded like he was urging Cormac to give up completely. After the doctor left, Phoebe knocked and stepped into the room. Cormac sat in his wheelchair, staring out the window with the new bottle of pills in his hand. He didn't turn when he heard her. Phoebe stood in the middle of the room and spoke plainly, without dressing it up. She told him that she'd once cared for an elderly man who'd suffered a severe stroke. The doctors had said he'd never walk again, that he should accept a wheelchair for life, but he didn't believe them. He trained every day, even when it hurt, even when he was exhausted, even when everyone said he was crazy. After 2 years, he could take 10 steps on his own without help. 10 steps wasn't much, but it was 10 steps the doctor said would never happen. He didn't have to believe the doctor. He could try. Cormac turned his wheelchair to face her. He gave a bitter laugh. The first smile Phoebe had seen on his face, even though there was nothing warm in it. He asked what she thought she knew about his body, about his injury, about the pain he lived with every day. She was just a caretaker. What did she have that gave her the right to stand there and advise him on whether he could walk? Phoebe didn't look away. She said she didn't know anything about his body, and she wasn't a doctor, but she understood what it meant not to quit. That was the only thing she had left after losing everything. If she quit, her 2 daughters would have no one. If she quit, her mother would die alone in a facility. She didn't have the right to quit, and she didn't think he should quit when he hadn't even tried yet. She set the tray down on the table and walked out, leaving Cormac alone with his thoughts. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkness, staring at the bottle of painkillers in his hand, and thought about what she'd said. It was the only thing she had left. The next morning, for the first time in 6 months, Cormac called Finn into his room and ordered him to contact the best physical therapy specialist from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Not someone Whitmore recommended. Someone from the outside. Finn couldn't hide his surprise, but he did it immediately. 2 days later, a physical therapy specialist from Northwestern came to evaluate Cormac. The weeks that followed were hell in a different way. Cormac trained every day under the specialist's guidance, and every session was a battle with his own body. Pain, exhaustion, frustration. There were days he wanted to quit, and then he'd think of Phoebe's words. Progress came slowly, but it came. After a month, he could stand for a few seconds with the support bar. His legs began to feel again, faint signals returning where there had been nothing. The Northwestern specialist said it was significant progress, more than he'd expected with an injury this severe. Something began to change in Cormac's eyes. A thin thread of hope he'd believed had died a long time ago. News that Cormac had started physical therapy reached Patrick Brennan within only a few days. He was sitting in an office at one of the Sullivan family's restaurants in Little Italy when Deirdre accidentally mentioned that her brother could stand for a few seconds now. Patrick kept the mask of polite happiness on his face, but inside, something went cold and tight. That very night, Patrick drove to a discreet hotel in Schaumburg, a suburb about 40 minutes outside Chicago. Meredith Kensington was already waiting in a suite on the 12th floor, a glass of red wine in her hand. She closed the door behind him, and the 2 of them sat across from each other at the table, leaving the main lights off, letting only the dim glow of a bedside lamp fill the room. Patrick told her what he'd heard, his voice threaded with worry. Cormac was recovering. He'd hired a specialist from Northwestern instead of using Whitmore. He'd started demanding to see the financial books and asking about the meetings Patrick had chaired in his place for the last 6 months. Meredith set her wine down and frowned. She said the woman and the 2 children were changing Cormac. Before they showed up, he'd stayed in that dark room drinking and waiting to die. Now he was training to walk again and paying attention to his empire. If Cormac recovered fully and took back control, he'd uncover the shady financial transactions from the last 2 years. He'd see that more than $18 million had been moved into their secret accounts. He'd find evidence of hiring an assassin, and then both of them would die. Patrick wanted to get rid of Phoebe immediately. He'd convinced Deirdre that the woman was a threat, a planted spy sent in to steal information. But Meredith shook her head. She said that was too obvious and it would make Cormac suspicious. He clearly had feelings for that woman. If Patrick pushed her out without a legitimate reason, Cormac would erupt and start digging into why. Meredith proposed something quieter, more precise. Use Dr. Whitmore to prescribe stronger medication, the kind that would keep Cormac dulled and unmotivated to train. At the same time, frighten Phoebe until she left on her own, aim at her daughters, or her mother dying in hospice. There was no need to hurt anyone, only to scare her badly enough that she'd run. And if none of that worked? Patrick asked, his voice tight with strain. Meredith looked him straight in the eye. Then they'd have to finish what the assassination attempt hadn't. This time there wouldn't be any mistakes. 1 week after that conversation, Phoebe got a call from the hospice facility where her mother was staying. The woman on the line said there was a problem with the automatic payment. Her card had been declined, and if it wasn't fixed within 7 days, her mother would be transferred to a public facility with far worse conditions. Phoebe panicked, checked her bank account, and found her card had been locked because someone had reported it stolen. But Phoebe had never reported any card missing. She called the bank, and they confirmed someone had called in and reported the card stolen on her behalf. She didn't understand what was happening, but she felt a chill crawl up her spine. That same day, Emmeline came home from school pale, her eyes full of fear. She said a man in a black suit had come to the school during recess. He'd stood outside the fence and asked about her mother, about the boss her mother was caring for, about the house they were living in. Emmeline had been scared and didn't answer, but the man had taken a photo of her before walking away. Phoebe pulled her daughter into her arms and felt her whole body tremble. She realized she wasn't just caring for an ordinary patient. She was standing in the middle of a world more dangerous than she'd ever imagined, and someone was targeting her and her children. At the same time, Finn O'Malley began to notice things that didn't sit right. He saw Patrick coming and going from the estate more often, whispering with Meredith in shadowed corners. He saw Dr. Whitmore bringing in new pill bottles he'd never seen before. With the instincts of a man who'd survived 40 years in the underworld, Finn knew something was wrong. He watched Patrick in secret, and discovered Patrick met Meredith at the Schaumburg Hotel, not once, but many times. Finn used old connections to dig deeper, and found suspicious financial transactions in the Sullivan books. Money was flowing out to somewhere without Cormac's permission. One night, Finn approached Phoebe in the kitchen while she was preparing dinner for Cormac. He glanced around to make sure no one was near, then spoke in a low voice. He warned her to be careful, to trust no one in that house except him and Cormac. There were people who wanted Cormac hurt, and they wouldn't hesitate to hurt her and her children too if she stood in their way. Phoebe met Finn's aged but blade-sharp eyes, and understood she was caught in a war whose rules she didn't even know. One night after an exhausting physical therapy session, Cormac sat in his wheelchair in his room, his body aching so badly he couldn't move himself into bed. The therapist had been gone for hours, and Finn was downstairs checking security. Cormac tried to lift himself, but his arms trembled, and he nearly fell. That was when Phoebe stepped in with her usual tray of tea. She saw him struggling and didn't say a word. She set the tray down and moved to his side. For the first time, she touched him not to serve or clean, but to hold him up. She slid her hand beneath his arm and helped him rise from the chair. Cormac could feel the strength in her slender hands, the strength of someone who'd spent years carrying more than she should have had to carry. He could also feel the warmth of her body as she supported him, guiding him in short steps toward the bed. When she eased him down, their faces were only inches apart. Cormac looked into Phoebe's brown eyes and, for the first time, he didn't see fear like he'd seen in the nurses before, and he didn't see the pity he hated most. He saw respect, and something warmer than that, something he didn't dare name. Phoebe looked back at him, and for a moment they both forgot their roles, forgot the distance between a boss and a caregiver, between wealth and poverty. Cormac asked quietly, his voice no longer cold or bitter the way it used to be. "Why are you still here? The money isn't worth enduring me like this. No one deserves to endure it." Phoebe was silent for a moment, then she answered. At first it was for the money. She needed it to pay the debt, to care for her mother, to raise her girls. But now, she didn't know anymore. She stepped out before Cormac could say anything else. The door closed softly, and neither of them slept that night. In the weeks that followed, something between them began to shift. Cormac wasn't only a patient anymore, and Phoebe wasn't only a caregiver. They began to talk to each other for real. Cormac told her about his father, Seamus Sullivan, who'd built the empire from nothing and was killed when Cormac was only 23. He told her about the night he got the call that his father had been shot in an ambush, about having to step up and take control when he was too young and unready, about having to become ruthless, to survive in a world where weakness meant death. He told her about the loneliness at the top, where everyone around him was either afraid of him or wanted to use him, where he couldn't trust anyone except Finn. Phoebe listened without judgment. Then she shared about Jonathan, about meeting him in a small coffee shop when she was 19, about their short but beautiful love, about the night she got the call from the hospital and her world collapsed. She told him about the 2 weeks she sat beside Jonathan's ICU bed, holding his hand, praying for a miracle that never came. She told him about the pain of losing him and having to stay strong for her children even while she was breaking inside. They found a shared language in pain and loneliness. Both of them had lost people they loved. Both of them had been forced to rebuild from ruins. Both of them wore a mask of strength to hide the wound underneath. Cormac began to bond with the girls in ways he never would have expected. He taught Emmeline chess in the library, surprised by the sharp mind and hunger to learn in a 6-year-old. And when Emmeline finally checkmated him after so many losses, Cormac smiled. A real smile, the first in years, not bitter or mocking, but the kind that came from pure joy. One night, Rosalie spiked a high fever in the middle of the night. Phoebe panicked because she didn't have money to take her to a hospital, and she didn't know what to do in this unfamiliar house. She started to call a taxi, but Cormac heard the commotion and wheeled himself in. When he understood what was happening, he didn't hesitate. He immediately called his private pediatrician from Lurie Children's Hospital, one of the best pediatric hospitals in the country. The doctor arrived within 45 minutes, even though it was close to midnight. Cormac wouldn't allow anyone to touch Rosalie except the best doctor money could buy. He stayed awake all night with Phoebe in Rosalie's room, sitting in his wheelchair by the bed, waiting for the fever to break. They didn't speak much, but Cormac's presence was everything Phoebe needed in that long night of fear. When morning was near and Rosalie's fever finally eased, the little girl opened her eyes and saw Cormac sitting beside her. She gave a weak smile and reached up to wrap her arms around his neck. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." Cormac went rigid. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had hugged him. Maybe it had been his mother before she died of cancer when he was 12. 25 years without anyone holding him. And now a 4-year-old was hugging him as if he were the most important person in the world. He didn't know what to do with the feeling rising in his chest. He just sat there, letting her hold him, and felt something begin to melt inside a heart he'd believed had frozen a long time ago. Late one night, when the entire estate had fallen asleep, Phoebe sat alone in the first-floor library with an old book she'd found on the shelf. She couldn't sleep. Her mind was crowded with worry about her mother in hospice, about the quiet threats she could feel in the air, and about the man upstairs whose place in her life she didn't know how to name. The warm yellow desk lamp lit the pages, but she couldn't take in a single word. The soft roll of wheels over hardwood made her lift her head. Cormac wheeled himself into the library, moving on his own now. No one helping him. He stopped a few feet from her and said nothing. Phoebe stayed silent too. They sat like that for a long time, with only the steady tick of the wall clock and the night wind brushing the windows. Then Cormac spoke, his voice low and rough in the late hours. He told her she was the only person who wasn't afraid of him. All his life, people had feared him. Men feared him because of his power. Women feared him because of his reputation. Even Deirdre, his own sister, feared him even though she'd never admit it, but Phoebe didn't. She was the only one who looked at him and didn't see a mafia boss, didn't see a cripple to pity, but only a man. Phoebe set the book down and met his eyes. She told him he was the only one who truly saw her too. Not a poor caretaker from the South Side, not a tragic widow with 2 small girls and a mountain of debt, just a woman. Simply a woman. Cormac wheeled closer. He lifted his hand and touched her face, his fingers brushing her cheekbone. Phoebe didn't pull away. She closed her eyes and leaned into his palm, the same hand that had once ordered men to die now touching her with a gentleness that made her feel like the most precious thing he'd ever held. He drew her closer and kissed her. The kiss was soft and slow, unhurried. For the first time in his life, Cormac kissed someone not out of desire, not for a purpose, not as a calculation, but because he wanted to, because of a pure feeling he hadn't known he could still feel. The kiss was brief, but it changed everything. When they pulled apart, Phoebe was trembling. She looked into Cormac's gray eyes and knew she'd crossed a line she couldn't step back over. She was falling in love with the most dangerous man she'd ever met, the boss of Chicago's underworld, the man who'd once ended lives with nothing more than a nod, and she didn't know whether that love would save her or destroy her. Patrick Brennan knew he couldn't wait any longer. Cormac was getting stronger by the day, and he'd started demanding access to the financial books for the family's businesses. He was asking about the meetings Patrick had chaired, about the decisions made over the last 6 months, about the money that had been spent. If Cormac kept digging, he would find everything. Patrick had to act now. He went to Deirdre one evening when she was sitting alone in the living room. He sat beside his wife and began planting seeds of doubt in a voice coated with fake concern. He said Phoebe wasn't as good as she seemed. He said she was manipulating Cormac while he was vulnerable, using his feelings to get close to money and power. He produced fabricated evidence claiming Phoebe had been in contact with the Sullivan family's rivals, that she might be a planted spy sent to gather information. Deirdre wanted to believe her husband. She loved her brother, but she couldn't deny the slow burn of jealousy inside her when she saw Cormac bonding with Phoebe and the girls in a way he'd never bonded with her. She saw her brother smile at them, talk to them, soften for them, while with Deirdre he always held himself behind a cold distance. That jealousy made it easy for her to accept Patrick's words without checking them. One morning, while Cormac was doing physical therapy upstairs, Deirdre found Phoebe in the kitchen. In a voice turned hard and flat, she told Phoebe she was fired effective immediately. She had 2 hours to pack and leave with her daughters. Phoebe went numb. She asked for an explanation, asked what she'd done wrong, but Deirdre wouldn't listen. Phoebe asked to see Cormac, but the guards Patrick had arranged blocked the way to the second floor and refused to let her near him. 2 hours later, Phoebe and her 2 girls were escorted to the gate with a few hastily packed bags, everything they owned in the world. Emmeline, 6, cried in silence, tears sliding down her cheeks without a sound. She'd learned not to cry out loud because she didn't want to make her mother worry. Rosalie, 4, didn't understand what was happening. She screamed for Mr. Sullivan, her clear little voice echoing across the wide garden, but no one answered. Phoebe held both girls tight and walked out into the October rain in Chicago. The cold wind cut through their thin clothes like a blade. She didn't have money for a taxi. She didn't know where to go. She only kept moving toward the nearest CTA bus stop and prayed they wouldn't freeze before they got back to the south side. When the physical therapy session ended and Cormac called for Phoebe to bring up water like she always did, no one answered. He called a second time, a third time, and the silence stayed heavy. He wheeled himself into the hallway and found another housemaid standing by the stairs, trembling like she was waiting for an explosion. He asked where Phoebe was, and the maid stammered that Phoebe had been thrown out with the 2 children more than an hour ago. Cormac felt blood rush into his face. He drove his wheelchair down to the first floor as fast as he could and found Deirdre sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, as if nothing had happened. For the first time in his life, he screamed in his sister's face. The sound filled the estate, loud enough that staff froze mid-step, shaking where they stood. He demanded to know who she thought she was, throwing his caregiver out without even asking him. Deirdre tried to explain. She said Phoebe was dangerous, that she was manipulating him, that Patrick had found proof she'd been in contact with their rivals. Cormac swept his arm and shattered the antique vase on the table. He broke the teacup, smashed the picture frame, destroyed anything within reach. But this wasn't the meaningless rage of the last 6 months. This was the focused fury of a boss who'd been betrayed. Patrick appeared and tried to calm him down. He said Phoebe was a threat, maybe a planted spy, and he'd only been protecting the family. Cormac stared at his brother-in-law with eyes cold as winter, and said he didn't believe a single word. He ordered Finn to find Phoebe at any cost and bring her and the girls back immediately. Finn nodded and vanished through the door. He drove through the Chicago rain, checking every CTA bus stop along the route from Lake Forest back toward the south side. After nearly an hour of searching, he spotted Phoebe sitting with her children at a small bus shelter. All 3 of them were soaked and shivering in the cutting wind. Phoebe didn't have enough money for a taxi and was waiting for the next bus. Emmeline sat silent with red-rimmed eyes. Rosalie had cried herself empty and now dozed in her mother's lap. Finn stepped out of the car and told Phoebe Cormac wanted her to come back. Phoebe looked at him with exhausted eyes and asked if she was truly welcome or if she'd be thrown out again. Finn told her he'd never seen Cormac that furious over anyone, and he promised no one would dare touch her again. When the car pulled up to the estate, and Phoebe stepped out with 2 limp, tired children in her arms, she saw Cormac had wheeled himself all the way to the front entrance to wait. It was the first time in more than 6 months he'd left his room to meet someone. He looked at Phoebe, drenched, her hair plastered to her face, looked at Emmeline and Rosalie shivering in the cold, and his voice caught when he spoke. "No one has the right to throw you out except me, and I'll never do that." Deirdre stood behind him in the living room, frozen as she watched her brother. She'd never seen him like this. She'd never seen him care enough about anyone to burn with anger when they were hurt. That night, after Phoebe and the girls had been warmed with hot baths and put to rest, Cormac called an emergency meeting with Deirdre, Patrick, and Meredith in the first-floor study. He sat at the head of the table in his wheelchair and declared in a voice that allowed no argument that he was taking full control of the Sullivan empire again, starting tomorrow. He demanded every financial record within 48 hours, and he stated that Phoebe and her daughters were under his protection, and anyone who harmed them would answer to him. Across from him, Patrick and Meredith sat with faces gone pale, knowing their time was running out. Finn O'Malley knew suspicion alone wasn't enough. He needed hard proof before he brought anything to Cormac. One night, while Patrick and Meredith were busy meeting with partners on the north side of the city, Finn drove to the law office building in downtown Chicago, where Meredith kept a private suite. He'd spent 40 years in the underworld, and he knew how to enter places other men couldn't. He disabled the alarm system, picked the back door lock, and slipped into Meredith's office on the 12th floor. What he found was worse than what he'd imagined. Inside a safe, hidden behind a painting, Finn discovered stacked documents proving illegal financial transactions over the last 2 years. Money from Cormac's businesses had been funneled into secret accounts under Patrick and Meredith's names through a complex web of shell companies. More than $18 million in total. But worse than all of it were the encrypted messages Finn found on Meredith's personal laptop. Messages between her and a middleman about the assassination attempt 6 months earlier. Meredith Kensington, the Sullivan family's attorney and Deirdre's closest friend, was the one who'd ordered a hit on Cormac. Finn photographed every page, copied the data from the laptop, then left without a trace. He drove straight back to the estate and knocked on Cormac's door at 2 a.m. Cormac was sitting in the dark as usual when Finn stepped in and placed the stack of documents on the desk. Finn didn't speak. He only turned on the light and let Cormac read. Cormac read each page, one by one. His face stayed cold as stone, not a flicker of expression. He didn't shout. He didn't smash anything the way he had when he learned Phoebe had been thrown out. His silence was more terrifying than any rage. When he reached the messages about the assassination, he stopped and stared at the screen for a long time. Meredith, the woman who'd eaten dinner with his family for 10 years. The woman who'd stood by his hospital bed when he woke after the shooting. The woman who'd cried and said she was so grateful he was alive. She was the one who'd ordered his death. He asked Finn about Deirdre in a low, even voice. Finn shook his head and said there was no evidence Deirdre had been involved. Patrick had handled logistics and money, but the one giving the order, the one who planned it and hired the assassin, was Meredith. Deirdre might only be another victim of the same deception that fooled everyone else. Cormac nodded slowly. He told Finn to prepare everything, but not to act yet. He wanted to handle this his way, on his time. Finn understood and left. Meanwhile, Meredith Kensington knew her time was running out. Cormac was demanding the books, and she couldn't hide forever. She decided to strike at Cormac's weakest point and force Phoebe to leave before everything blew open. That night, while Phoebe was putting the girls to bed, she received a message from an unknown number. Attached was a video of her mother, Dorothy, sleeping in the hospice facility. The camera slowly zoomed in on the IV line, on the heart monitor blinking numbers in the dark. The message beneath it was a single sentence. "Leave Sullivan immediately if you want your mother to keep breathing." Phoebe shook so hard she almost dropped her phone. She watched it again, stared at her mother's thin face in sleep, at the tubes and wires tying her to life. Someone had gotten into her mother's room and recorded this. Someone could kill her mother at any moment. She knew she should be afraid and run, but she also knew that if she left, the people threatening her would win, and Cormac would never learn the truth. She made her decision in a heartbeat. At midnight, she went to Cormac's door and knocked. When he opened it, she handed him the phone with the video and the threat, not saying a word. Cormac watched it, then took her hand. He looked straight into her eyes and swore without a hint of hesitation that no one would touch her mother or her daughters. He immediately called Finn and ordered Dorothy moved that night to a secret medical facility controlled by the Sullivan family, a place no one could access except the people he trusted. He assigned private security to Emmeline and Rosalie 24 hours a day. When everything was in motion, Phoebe stood in the room and started to cry. It was the first time she'd cried in front of anyone since Jonathan died 3 years earlier. She cried from relief, from gratitude, and from the sudden clarity that she loved this man far more deeply than she'd allowed herself to admit. Cormac didn't speak. He only pulled her close and let her cry in his arms. The first time in his life he held someone not out of obligation, but because he wanted to protect them with everything he had. On the morning before the confrontation, Cormac trained with a determination Phoebe had never seen in him before. He knew what was waiting for him tomorrow, and he refused to face a traitor from a wheelchair. He'd been a victim long enough. It was time for the people who'd tried to kill him to see they'd failed. The physical therapist from Northwestern Memorial arrived earlier than usual and started the session as soon as the sun was up. Cormac gripped the support bar with both hands and poured every ounce of strength into his legs. Sweat ran down his forehead, his muscles trembling with strain, but he refused to sit. 1 minute. He stood for 1 full minute with the bar's support before his legs buckled and he had to drop back into the chair. The therapist stared at him, stunned. He said that with spinal cord damage like Cormac's, most patients never walk again. They accept the wheelchair as part of life and learn to live with it. But Cormac was proving the opposite. His progress was extraordinary, almost impossible to explain with ordinary medicine. Something was driving him past the limits of his body. Phoebe stayed beside him through the entire session. She didn't speak. She didn't cheer loudly or offer hollow encouragement. She only stood there and took his hand whenever he tired and broke into sweat. She gave him a towel when he needed it, and a bottle of water when he did. Her quiet presence was everything he needed to keep going. That night, when the estate had gone still and Finn had finished every arrangement for tomorrow, Cormac sat alone in his room with a fierce resolve burning inside him. He looked at the wheelchair that had caged him for 6 months, then braced his hand on the bed frame and began to lift himself. No support bar, no therapist watching, only him and the legs, the doctors had said, would never work again. He rose, slowly, shaking, in pain, but he rose. 30 seconds. He stood for 30 seconds without any support before he had to sit again. That was when Phoebe walked in and saw him breathing hard from what he'd just forced his body to do. She knew immediately what she'd witnessed. Cormac looked at her and said with hard certainty that tomorrow he would stand in front of them. He wouldn't face a traitor from this chair. He would stand on his own legs, even if it was only for a few minutes. Phoebe stepped to his side and took his hand. She told him she'd be right there with him, no matter what happened. They sat in silence for a long time, their hands locked together, ready for the final battle. The next morning, Cormac summoned a meeting with Patrick, Meredith, and several smaller bosses from the Empire in the conference room beneath the estate. This was the room where his father, Cormac Sullivan, had once sat at the head of the table and made decisions that shaped Chicago's underworld for 30 years. The Sullivan family's power had been built across generations inside these walls, and today Cormac was taking back what belonged to him. Patrick and Meredith arrived wearing manufactured confidence. They believed Cormac was still a weakened cripple in a wheelchair. Easy to manipulate, easy to fool. They came armed with carefully altered financial records and a plan to dump the blame on an accountant they'd made disappear the week before. They were certain everything had been covered perfectly. Everyone took their seats around the long oak table and waited. Patrick sat where he'd sat for the last 6 months, close to the head of the table as if he were the one in control. Meredith sat beside him with a stack of documents in front of her and her familiar, polite smile. Deirdre sat in the corner with worry on her face, not knowing what was about to happen. Then the door opened, and the room went still. Cormac Sullivan walked in, not in a wheelchair like they expected, but on his feet. His steps were slow and unsteady, each one a massive effort, but he was upright and moving under his own power. Finn O'Malley stayed at his side, ready to catch him if needed, but Cormac didn't let him touch him. He wanted to do this himself. Silence pressed down as Cormac crossed the stone floor from the door to the head of the table. Each footfall echoed like a heartbeat. Patrick's face drained of color as he watched the man he'd assumed was permanently neutralized now standing in front of him. Meredith tried to keep her composure, but her fingers clenched the papers so hard her knuckles went white. Cormac reached the head of the table and lowered himself into the chair of command, the seat he hadn't taken in 6 months. He swept his gaze around the room, steel, cold, gray eyes stopping on each face in turn. Patrick opened his mouth to offer congratulations on the miracle recovery, but Cormac lifted a hand for silence. He nodded once to Finn, and the older bodyguard stepped forward and placed a thick stack of documents on the table. Cormac began to speak in a low, even voice without emotion. Each fraudulent transaction was listed in detail, with exact dates and amounts. Each secret account in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland was exposed with the account holders' names printed clearly: Patrick Brennan and Meredith Kensington. Each encrypted message between Meredith and the middleman about the assassination attempt, was projected on the screen. More than $18 million had been stolen over 2 years. Patrick's expression shifted from controlled to panicked as he realized there was nowhere left to run. Meredith fought to stay calm, but her hands shook and her voice fractured when she tried to argue back. Cormac looked Meredith straight in the eyes and asked her directly, "Why did you want me dead? For money? For power? Or because you love my sister's husband?" Meredith stayed silent, her lips pressed into a hard line. Patrick tried to protest, claiming the evidence was fabricated, that someone was trying to tear the family apart, but the proof was too clear, and no one in the room believed him anymore. Cormac rose slowly. He walked toward Patrick and Meredith, each step a declaration that the real boss had returned. He stopped in front of them and said in a voice cold as ice that he'd thought about killing them the way his father would have done it. A bullet to the head, their bodies dropped into Lake Michigan. But he wasn't his father anymore. He'd changed. They wouldn't die as martyrs of the underworld. They would face the law like ordinary criminals. Their assets would be seized. Their reputations would be destroyed. They would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. And every morning they woke up, they'd know the man they tried to kill was still alive and happy. Finn signaled, and the security team moved in to restrain Patrick and Meredith. They fought, but it didn't matter. Outside the estate, FBI agents who'd been alerted in advance were already waiting. Cormac had arranged everything with a federal prosecutor days earlier. He'd decided not to handle this the underworld way, but the legal way, and that was the heaviest punishment he could give to the people who'd betrayed him. Dr. Henry Whitmore was also taken into custody, facing charges of medical malpractice and conspiracy to commit murder. Deirdre Sullivan sat in the corner of the room and watched everything collapse in front of her. She watched her husband in handcuffs, watched her closest friend being led away, and felt the world she thought she knew breaking into pieces. Patrick had been her husband for 7 years. Meredith had been her best friend since college. They'd stood beside her at her wedding. They'd eaten dinner with her every week. They'd shared secrets and anxieties with her. And now she understood they'd betrayed not only her brother, but her too. When the security team marched Patrick past her, Meredith suddenly stopped and let out a bitter laugh. She turned to Deirdre with a look of contempt she'd kept hidden for 10 years. Meredith told the truth because she had no reason to hide it anymore. She and Patrick had been in love for a long time, long before he married Deirdre. They'd waited and planned for years to build an empire of their own. Cormac had been the only obstacle. If he died, Patrick would take power, and Meredith would control the money. Deirdre had been nothing but a pawn, a doorway Patrick used to enter the Sullivan family. Nothing more. Deirdre heard it and dropped to her knees on the floor. She wasn't crying because she'd lost her husband. She was crying because she realized her entire marriage had been a lie. She cried because she'd trusted the wrong people, because she'd helped throw Phoebe out without knowing she was being used. She cried because she'd almost lost her brother forever because of her blindness. Cormac watched his sister for a moment, then slowly walked over. It was the first time in years he'd moved toward Deirdre on his own. He lowered himself beside her, legs still weak, but he didn't care. He wrapped his arms around her and said softly that he didn't blame her. She was a victim of the traitors too, just like he was. They'd been fooled by the people they trusted most. Deirdre clung to her brother and sobbed into his chest. A few weeks after Patrick and Meredith were arrested, a new witness came forward. He was someone who'd worked for the crew, hired to carry out the assassination attempt 6 months earlier. He agreed to talk in exchange for a reduced sentence and placement in federal witness protection. What he revealed was darker than anything Cormac had known. Meredith hadn't only wanted him dead, she'd wanted him to die in pain and despair. She'd instructed the shooter to aim for the spine so Cormac would be paralyzed first, then slowly fade as he lost the will to live. She didn't want a quick death. She wanted him to suffer. She wanted him to hurt. She wanted him to give up on life in hopelessness. But the shooter had missed the exact shot, and Cormac survived with an injury that wasn't fatal. Dr. Henry Whitmore had been directed by Meredith to carry out the rest of the plan. He prescribed high-dose painkillers to keep Cormac dulled and unmotivated to train. He pushed Cormac to accept his fate and abandon hope of walking again. If Cormac didn't die from the wound, they would let him die from surrender. Cormac sat in his study and listened to the witness through a video call with the federal prosecutor. He didn't speak. He didn't show emotion. But when the call ended, he understood that if Phoebe hadn't appeared when she did, he might have surrendered and faded exactly the way Meredith wanted. He'd been that close to the edge. He'd been drinking every night, driving everyone away, drowning in darkness, destroying himself. Phoebe and the girls had pulled him back from an abyss he hadn't even known he was falling into. That afternoon, Cormac found Phoebe in the garden behind the estate. She was sitting on a stone bench beneath an old oak, watching Emmeline and Rosalie chase each other across the green lawn. Warm, late-day sunlight caught in her hair, and the girls' laughter rang through the air. Cormac walked over and sat beside her. He didn't need the wheelchair anymore, even though he still moved slowly and sometimes used a cane when he was tired. He took Phoebe's hand and told her in a low, steady voice that she'd saved him, not only from death, but from himself. She'd given him a reason to stand, to fight, to keep living when he'd already let go of hope. Phoebe rested her head on his shoulder and watched her daughters running in the distance. She told him he'd saved her too. He'd given her and the girls a home, protected her mother, and given her a reason to believe life could be good again after everything she'd lost. They sat together in silence, hands clasped tight, watching the girls play beneath the sunset. For the first time in years, both of them felt peace. 1 year after that fateful confrontation, Cormac Sullivan could walk almost normally again. He still used a cane when he had to go far or stand too long, but inside the house he moved freely without any help at all. The doctors called his recovery a medical miracle. Cormac knew it wasn't a miracle. It was the result of iron determination and the love of a woman who hadn't quit on him when everyone else walked away. Over the past year, Cormac had completely redirected the Sullivan empire. He pulled out of illegal operations step by step and focused on legitimate business, real estate, restaurants, hotels, the kind of industries where money could be earned cleanly and openly. He didn't do it out of fear of the law or out of weakness. He did it because he wanted to build a different legacy for the future, for Emmeline, for Rosalie, and for the children he hoped to have with Phoebe. He didn't want his kids growing up in the same darkness he had. One autumn evening, when the leaves outside the windows had turned a blazing yellow-orange, Cormac led Phoebe into the first-floor library. It was where they'd kissed for the first time more than a year ago, under warm lamplight and late-night silence. Phoebe didn't know what he was doing until he stopped in the middle of the room and turned to face her. Cormac wanted to kneel the way tradition demanded, but his legs still weren't strong enough for it. Instead, he stood in front of her with his back straight and his head held high, holding a small velvet box in Tiffany blue. He opened it, and inside was a diamond ring that was simple but elegant, not too large, not showy, perfect for the woman he loved. He asked, his voice shaking slightly with nerves, if she would be his wife. Phoebe said yes before he could even finish the question. She didn't need time to think. She didn't need to hesitate. She'd known her answer for a long time. Cormac slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms. They stood there in the library for a long time, holding each other, not needing anything else. Emmeline and Rosalie were the first to know. Phoebe and Cormac called the girls into the living room and told them they were getting married. Emmeline beamed and ran to hug them both. Rosalie jumped up and wrapped her arms around Cormac's neck with the uncontrollable excitement of a 5-year-old. In that clear, sweet voice, she asked if she could call him Dad now. Cormac went still. He looked down at the little girl with blonde curls and wide eyes staring up at him with hope. He nodded because he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and he felt something warm melting through his chest. It was the first time in his life anyone had called him Dad, and he hadn't known 2 simple words could make him that happy. The wedding was held in the garden behind the estate, beneath the ancient oak tree Cormac had once stared at from his wheelchair, but had never dared to approach. That oak had witnessed his darkest days, and now it would witness his happiest one. The ceremony was simple and intimate, attended only by the people closest to them. Deirdre stood in the front row with red-rimmed eyes and a radiant smile. It had taken her months to heal from the betrayal Patrick and Meredith had inflicted, and in the end, she'd learned how to forgive herself for the mistakes she'd made when she didn't know the truth. Finn O'Malley stood beside Cormac like a spiritual father, the loyal old protector who'd stayed with him for more than 15 years, and never walked away even in the hardest hours. Dorothy, Phoebe's mother, sat in a cushioned chair with a satisfied smile. She was doing much better since being moved to the Sullivan family's medical facility, and even though the cancer was still there, she'd lived long enough to see her daughter happy. A few loyal staff members were there too, the ones who'd remained with the Sullivan family through every rise and fall. Cormac walked down the aisle on his own feet, no cane, no one supporting him. Every step he took on the green grass was proof of the road he'd survived. From a wheelchair in a pitch-dark room to this, standing tall under spring sunlight, waiting for the woman who'd saved his life. Phoebe stepped out from the back doors of the estate in a simple but elegant white wedding dress. Emmeline and Rosalie walked ahead, scattering petals, both girls grinning in pale pink dresses. When Phoebe reached Cormac and they took each other's hands in front of the officiant, they both understood this was the beginning of a new chapter. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Emmeline and Rosalie couldn't hold back anymore. The girls ran forward and wrapped their arms around both Cormac and Phoebe. For the first time in his life, Cormac Sullivan had a real family. Not a family of blood and violence the way his father had left behind, but a family made of love and healing. 1 year after the wedding, Phoebe gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When Cormac held his son for the first time, he didn't think about the wheelchair that had trapped him. He didn't think about the betrayal of the people he'd once trusted. He didn't think about the dark years when he'd wanted to give up on everything. He thought only about the present and the future, about the small child sleeping peacefully in his arms, about his wife smiling at him from the hospital bed, about his 2 daughters waiting with bright impatience to meet their new baby brother. The Lake Forest estate, once a cold prison that held a lonely monster, was now filled with the laughter of 3 children. Emmeline, 8, had become a thoughtful big sister, always helping her mother with the baby. Rosalie, 6, was still innocent and endlessly talkative, still calling Cormac Dad in that clear, sweet voice every day. And the newborn boy brought a new kind of joy to all of them. Cormac walked through the garden every day without a cane. Every step reminded him of one simple truth. Even if someone plans for you to fall, they can't control how you choose to rise. Life can throw the most brutal trials at us, the most painful betrayals, the losses that can't be repaired. But it's in the darkest moments that we find the truest light, and that light often comes from the places we'd never expect. For Cormac, that light was a desperate mother with 2 little girls, the woman who'd knocked on his door when no one else dared to step inside, and who stayed when everyone else walked away. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you felt moved and you'd like to hear more meaningful stories like this every day, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video with the people you love. We'd truly love to know how you felt about Cormac and Phoebe's story. Have you ever been through a time when it felt impossible to stand up again? Did you have someone beside you who helped you through your darkest hours? Leave a comment and share what's in your heart. We're listening. Wishing everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and love that fills your days. And remember, no matter how hard life gets, if you don't give up, the light will come. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.